Equipment RNG in the gachas I play is awful, and the solutions are a joke. It's a common theme across all these games that if you want your account to be strong, you need to spend a ridiculous amount of time grinding away in the equipment mines with no guarantee you'll ever strike gold. Some people claim to enjoy the experience, others argue it's a necessary evil to keep people coming back or provide at least something to fill the content drought between updates, and it's pretty clear that the devs themselves want these systems to be central to their games. But from what I've seen, they're frustrating at best and ultimately drive away many who otherwise enjoy playing. And on some level at least, the devs do acknowledge that this is a problem they need to fix. They drag their feet as much as they can, but now that there's some competition in the space, they're at least pretending to make it a little less of a pain to deal with, though the way they always kneecap any features they release to fix this is just ridiculous. Since a couple of the games I play have done just that in recent updates, it's a perfect time to talk about it. For me, equipment RNG is a tear in the illusion of any game's world. I want to be immersed in the experience, and instead I find that these systems always push me to look at the game from an outside perspective. I stop thinking about the game itself and start to question, am I enjoying the moment-to-moment combat while farming? Does the potential for improvement offset the frustration of dealing with these asinine systems? Does my distaste for this part of the game dilute my enjoyment of the other aspects to the point where as a whole it's no longer worth it for me? Where do I draw that line? And further to gaming in general, I have a finite number of hours to enjoy in this life, and every heartbeat is one less left to me. Am I wasting them here, searching for brief moments of shared meaning inside soulless systems designed to trap my attention? Could they perhaps be better spent elsewhere? Well, the answer to that last one is undoubtedly yes in a general sense. Dedicating time to leisure is vital for a balanced life, and games will always be one of my favourite ways to spend that time. For now, these games perch just on the right side of that equation for me, though it takes very little for them to lose their balance and fall out of my good graces. And while I absolutely despise RNG, I have to acknowledge that the developers put these systems in place for a reason, and some of them do contribute to some aspect of these games which I enjoy. Let's talk through the developers' perspective on these systems and why they decide to implement them, the mitigations some of these games have put in place to make them less problematic, and then cover the downsides of each aspect from the player's perspective too. But before we get to that, let's quickly define exactly what we're talking about here. Each game system has a different name. Genshin has artifacts, Wuthering Waves has echoes, Honkai Star Rail has relics, and so on. While each has some unique quirks which make them stand out, in short, they are a special type of equipment which make a major contribution to your character's strength. You obtain these items by completing combat challenges, and your rate of improvement is throttled by a slowly regenerating account stamina or energy resource, resin in Genshin, wave plates in Wuwa, and so on. When you spend this resource in exchange for a piece of equipment, the RNG party begins. Take Genshin for example. First, there's a coin flip for which of the two equipment sets you receive, then a 1 in 5 chance of getting the right type of artifact for the slot you want to fill. Once you win the 1 in 10 chance of getting what you want, there's more. Does it have the right main stat? How many substat does it start off with? How strong is each substat? When you level it, which substat does it upgrade? How strong is the upgrade? And those last two repeat 5 times by the time the artifact is finished. The odds for each step of substat RNG are obscure, and they're weighted against the stats that characters actually want. Each character needs 5 artifacts, and there's a lot of characters someone might want to use, so all this RNG means building up your account can take years of dedicated effort. It's important to note that while we are talking about gachas here, I'm not including the RNG in other parts of the game, even though they do have an effect on character strength, be that gacha for weapons or constellations, or RNG for upgrade material quantities or weekly boss drops. Instead, we're focusing on equipment which is most associated with the slow and steady grind for long-term improvement. So what's in it for the devs? The first thing they get out of it is deferred player power progression, one of those interesting areas where the priorities of the devs are slightly at odds with the desires of the players. Players want their characters to feel fun to play, and a key part of that comes from their level of strength. While there's a whole separate discussion to be had about how self-destructive it is for the player base to clamour for ever stronger characters, it's undeniable that for many players, the power fantasy aspect is one of the central driving motivations which leads to them playing the game at all. Big number make brain go burr. However, while the devs do want to give the players that feeling, one thing they want more is for players to keep coming back over a long period of time. There are some further nuances to that which we'll cover in a minute, but this is strongly tied to the player's desire for power. For those who do get a thrill out of putting bigger numbers on their screens, if they could perfect the character's equipment on day one, then a huge motivation for their continued engagement with the game would disappear. The devs, therefore, want a way to spread out those power gains over a long period of time so that these players have a reason to keep coming back. They could get the same effect without those many layers of RNG, of course, but then they'd miss out on some of the other aspects which are just as important. For example, these equipment systems are designed to exploit psychological tricks in order to provide very strong hooks which drive people to keep playing. The technical term here is operant conditioning with a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. This means they're conditioning you to follow the behavior they want by providing inconsistent rewards. The inconsistency of those rewards makes this far more potent as a motivational force than it would be if they were consistent. While the gacha system itself is designed to trigger those same parts of our psychology, the equipment systems are far more central to the gameplay experience. After all, for many more dedicated players, the grind for incremental improvements takes up the majority of their playtime, and they're very obviously designed to provide exactly the kind of variable rewards which exploit this most effectively. And the multi-layered randomness involved can also indirectly lead to monetization. When you combine many dice rolls in a row, the combined chance of getting the perfect result plummets. Combine that low chance with the severe restrictions in place which limit how many times you can roll the dice per day, and you get a very frustrating experience when chance doesn't go your way. When players are motivated to get that perfect build, or heck, even just reach a point where some new character they just spent a ton of currency on is usable, this combination can make it very tempting to just spend a little in order to have another go. These games do tend to have a hard cap on the number of times you can do this per day, but yet again that feels more like a way to prevent big spenders from blasting through all their build progression in no time at all than an attempt to avoid making things too predatory. Slow and steady wins the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I guess. The most common pushback when people defend these equipment systems is that it's valuable for player retention and engagement. It's a fundamental fact that the amount of time it takes to create something far exceeds the amount of time it takes someone to enjoy that thing. Tens of thousands of hours of design and writing and development to create a game which you can blast through in a couple of weekends. For other games, that's often a feature, not a bug, but these are life service games. Their entire purpose is to gather an audience and keep it engaged over the long term, so that the devs can compound their income by extending an existing game rather than starting over. While a large part of what keeps players coming back is the ongoing story and the regular cadence of fresh things to do in the game they already enjoy, for many, the content released every 6 weeks takes a couple of days to play, even in the patches where there's a lot more to do on average, and it's more of a problem the more dedicated you are to the game. What can the devs do to keep players engaged after they've played through all of the one-time content? RNG equipment fills that gap for many. It extends the game by giving players an almost impossible goal to aim for, providing purpose to daily logins and an endless grind which rewards regular play. It even builds up the community aspect. Some players love showing off, many bond over disappointment and the pain of the experience, and there's always meme potential. And of course the devs will particularly appreciate that it increases the stickiness of the game. By the time someone has played one of these games for a year or more, their account is going to have a decent amount of good equipment. When another game comes along which is even a mild improvement on that earlier game, one of the things which might stop people from moving over is the daunting thought of having to give up all that progress and start from scratch in the new game. Of course, it's not without its downsides, but we'll get to those later. And finally, one minor benefit which rarely gets mentioned is that it does add a little more replayability to the game. One of the things I found most engaging when talking about these games is how wildly different everyone's experience is, especially early on. This is most strongly influenced by the gacha system. Each player will have a completely different roster of characters available, so helping people figure out which they should focus on building or how best to use what they've got to create functional teams can be a really fun puzzle. Equipment RNG has a much smaller effect than the gacha system does, but it does make some difference, since it essentially adds a small amount of random variation to the strength of any given character. This can be beneficial for truly dedicated players if they ever want to play again for a second account. Many people enjoy trying out different challenges, speedruns, or even just more casual playthrough, and having this undercurrent of randomness built in can add a little bit of depth to each experience. So what about those mitigations the devs build in to soften the blow of all that RNG? One kind of half feature is when the game lets you destroy a number of useless pieces of equipment and obtain a new one in exchange, with the new equipment being completely random. This is a minor positive, since it means that if you have bad luck, at least you get more chances to roll the dice, but that is very minor, and honestly in the game I play, which has this, it's an absolute pain to use. A Strongbox takes this a little further, allowing you some small amount of control over the piece of equipment created through this process. In Genshin, for example, you get to pick one specific artifact set to generate, removing that first layer of RNG from the equation. The experience still sucks, in my opinion, and while many swear by using Strongboxes, I've only ever had endless bad luck while using them. Next, reroll systems, which let you take an existing piece of equipment and wipe out some part of their stats so you can try another roll of the dice. The idea here is to leave that initial grind intact, but provide some way for players to try again later down the line if their equipment doesn't roll well in the first place. The big downside to this is that a reroll still involves rolling the dice. You still have to trust to chance to give you what you want. Genshin added a reroll system recently, and in theory, some of it looks promising. You first pick 2 substats to aim for, and at least 2 of the upgrades are guaranteed to roll into those stats. If the other upgrades rolled into the substats you didn't want, you can keep re-rolling the same artifact, and it tracks how many re-roll attempts you have used and eventually adds more guarantees, until eventually all upgrades will roll into the stats you picked. Unfortunately, while this does sound like a great way to balance the system, making full use of it would cost a lot of the quill items, and those are super rare, so you're only going to be able to do this a handful of times per patch. For now, this feels like a good solution, which is locked away to the point where you can barely ever use it, and for those who have consistent bad luck, it simply won't make much of a difference. Another feature, which actually removes some of the RNG, is a stat selector. The idea here is to allow players to pick an individual stat on an existing piece and replace it with one they want instead. In theory, this could be done with any aspect of the equipment, including set, slot, main stat, and substats, but so far the only one I've encountered personally is the main stat selector, which Wuthering Waves added recently. And of course, this comes with its own huge caveat. It can only be used on an echo which has not yet been leveled, so while it's great to pick a main stat, you have no clue what the substats will be. And so, of course, chances are you'll have the frustrating experience of spending a rare item to convert an echo to the main stat you want, only for it to roll into utterly useless substats with no way to fix that. It's a great way to provide some use to the absolute deluge of echoes you get with functionally useless main stats, but it feels way less impactful than it could have been. More valuable are crafting systems in which you use a rare item to craft a new piece of equipment, which gives you much more control. Using Genshin as the example again, when you craft an artifact, you pick the set, the slot, the main stat, and 2 substats. And there's a guarantee that at least 2 of the upgrades will roll into your selected stats. This can make a huge difference, but is kneecapped by 2 things. First, the remaining layers of RNG mean it's depressingly common for the artifact to end up being pretty mediocre. It's best used to replace your absolute worst equipment, and it's not all that valuable for anyone chasing perfection. And second, there are big restrictions placed on using the system in the first place. They're very stingy in how many elixir items they give out, so you have to be very picky when deciding what to craft. And worse, they only let you craft 1 artifact from each set per patch. If you want to craft a full 4-piece set for a character, so you don't have to waste time farming a domain just for them, then you have to wait months before you can actually build that character. Ridiculous, considering they already impose severe limits on crafting via the elixirs. So far, I've again had pretty poor luck with these, with my rolls going into flat stats more often than not. I'm glad it exists, but it doesn't solve the bigger problems. One unique quirk to Wuthering Waves' take on equipment is that it allows players to farm items almost infinitely. You can wander around the open world defeating enemies, and each time you do, there's a percentage chance they'll leave an echo behind, which you can capture and use as equipment. Many people were so excited to finally be free of the time gates which restrict farming equipment in previous games, but unfortunately, in practice this solved nothing. It is nice to collect echoes as you play, though it's worth mentioning that enemies in other games do drop equipment too. The actual difference is that you can get 5-star echoes, which are actually usable. Despite that, deliberately farming them in the overworld turns out to be just as mind-numbing as fighting a Tazet field over and over, and far more time-consuming. It might have been worth it on balance, but unfortunately you can't level your echoes or unlock their substats without collecting other materials which are locked behind the exact same kind of account energy system which people were hoping to get away from. As it is, it's at least no worse than the systems in other games, but sadly it wasn't the game changer people hoped for. And it's also worth mentioning loadouts, though they are a little bit of a tangent. Loadouts are a feature which lets you create full sets of equipment and then quickly swap between them whenever you want your characters to have a different build. And there are actually two very different motivations people have for requesting this. The first motivation is the main reason loadouts are relevant to this discussion. Many players want to be able to create a small number of powerful sets of equipment and to share those sets across many characters. This would mean you could farm fewer items, since you could have 5 or 6 full sets of equipment shared across a couple of dozen characters rather than a full set per character. This is the approach which Wuthering Waves has implemented, and many players absolutely love it. While that is perfect for people who want to min-max, this is actually not what I always wanted. I don't care about min-maxing and hate having to constantly check whether the character I want to use has the right equipment applied. Instead, I care about flexibility and variety. I always wanted to have multiple loadouts per character, with the goal being to have multiple different builds which enable each character to be optimized for different roles. For example, Genshin's Raiden Shogun could have either an Electro DPS or a full EM build, or Yanfei could have a Pyro DPS or a shield support build, and so on. Some characters could want even more. Note that if a game were to implement the type of loadout that I want, it would actually make the issues we're talking about worse, since it would mean I'd need even more builds. But since I don't want to min-max, that's less of a problem for me. A combination of the two approaches would be ideal, since then everybody would be happy. And of course, we can't mention loadouts without emphasizing that whatever Genshin are doing for this is just an utter joke at this point. A long while ago, they announced that they were adding loadouts, but it turned out to be an auto-equipper instead. And just a few weeks ago, they announced loadouts again, only for it to mean you can save 2 configurations to that auto-equipper itself per character, but can't customize the artifacts it selects, rendering it utterly pointless for either of these use cases. At this point, it's hard to tell whether they're just very slowly working their way towards implementing the loadouts people have been requesting for half a decade now, or just flat out trolling us all. So, how does this feel from the player's perspective? When it comes to progression, it's kinda mixed. Getting a lucky roll can give you a dopamine hit, but this is offset by the frustration felt for the rest of the time, so the balance there will depend on the player. In the long term, it is nice to see gradual improvement and build a sense of ownership across your account, but that's not unique to systems with such emphasis on RNG, and if anything, the randomness neuters much of ownership you could feel. There are some people who love optimizing their builds for theoretical damage output, and there is some sense of accomplishment gained from putting together a strong build, but at a fundamental level, the RNG involved throws away true player agency. If you ever compare this to the experience of customizing a character's build in games like Baldur's Gate, Final Fantasy, or Expedition 33, the difference is stark. And since there are always going to be some people who are abnormally unlucky, systems which lean too heavily into RNG at best demotivate those players due to a sense of unfairness it provides, or worse, risk introducing progression walls where players are unable to continue due to lack of adequate equipment rather than any skill issues. You could argue that the equipment doesn't make that big a difference, but if that were true, then players wouldn't have much of a reason to bother in the first place. And for longevity, it's also a double-edged sword. Gear optimization can add depth and replayability, and once you have an extensive inventory of equipment, it can be fun to try out different combinations and tweak your builds until they really work together. But while many say that it's the main repeatable content of the game, there's only so much time you can spend fiddling with your equipment before it starts to feel very mundane. For my taste, it feels like sticking a plaster of a profound lack of ideas for how to make these games engaging for long-term players, and a way to artificially inflate the gameplay time without providing much value in return. They aim to bring people back by promising a chance to make their accounts slightly stronger, even though this means any future content will be less challenging and therefore potentially less fun. I wish they'd find some way to drive engagement by making a day-to-day experience of endgame player enjoyable instead. Much of the real long-term fun comes from player creativity, speedruns, restricted playthroughs, and so on, so perhaps that might be a better direction to take. The endless grind for improvements with no guarantee for success is a recipe for burnout. It can be good for retention. After all, if you see another game with a similar system, the idea of starting over can be a daunting prospect. But that perspective fails to see that there are so many other games which don't have these systems at all. It's only a matter of time before a live service gacha takes inspiration from those instead removes that barrier for entry completely and reaps the rewards from actually being player friendly. Once that happens, the existing games may have some tough decisions to make, and from a monetization perspective, it's self-evidently hostile towards the players. These systems are designed in a way which is intended to frustrate, partly to keep players hooked on a potential that they could get what they want, but also in the hopes that they will part with some cash in order to get extra rolls of the dice. Yes, this is just how gachas work, and it is kinda what people expect when they sign up for a gacha game, but that does not make it any less worth highlighting, and it doesn't mean there is no hope for things to get better. I also suspect that there's a hidden downside to these systems, even from the devs' perspective. Multiple times I've considered pulling for a new character, but in the end decided to skip, and one of the things which contributed to that decision was the thought of having to go through the pain of building yet another character. I've talked to many people who dropped the game entirely because of this kind of experience, and I always wonder how widespread it is. I'd be curious to know how accurately any analysis the game companies run can capture such a subtle cause and effect. And finally, the way devs tend to treat these systems leaves players feeling like their feedback is being completely ignored. It's understandable for them to be cautious. If they make a change which tips things too far in the other direction, it would be very unpopular for them to roll it back. It's far safer to make tiny incremental improvements and see how each change affects the equipment economy before taking the next step towards improvements. But the pace at which certain developers are doing this is truly glacial. Genshin only really started addressing any of these issues once Wuwa appeared on the scene, for example, and each iteration they make is very small, very limited, and frankly, very disappointing. Other devs are moving noticeably faster, but still seem reluctant to make more fundamental changes, and I totally get why they're cautious. Fortunately, new games coming out have the opportunity to take much more drastic steps. Just look at Duet Night Abyss, which I covered in my previous video. I tried it out for that first look, and was legitimately excited to see solutions to so many of the perpetual issues which plague gacha games, including the complete removal of RNG from the equipment system. As I emphasized in the video, those were very early first impressions, meaning we have no way to know yet how effective the system will be in the long run, how grindy it is, and so on, but regardless of whether that game delivers on its early promise, we can hope that the existence of such ideas in the market and the fans' reaction to them will be a force for change in the existing games as well. RNG equipment is a double-edged sword for the developers. It can fuel engagement and improve retention, but the endless treadmill can introduce a whole host of problems and lead to player frustration or even apathy and burnout in the long run. They aim to combine randomness with player agency, and while the balance they strike obviously appeals to many players, for my taste they lean too far towards randomness for me to ever find them satisfying. It's possible this could feel different. Maybe some of the mitigations they've already built could work if they weren't so tightly restricted, or maybe the RNG would feel fine if there wasn't such a hard time gate in place blocking us from making improvements. I'm curious what other people think. Is RNG a necessary evil for a live service single player game? Is there some way they could fix it, or is it just an outdated design which should be phased out as soon as possible? Until next time.